In the first part of the 20th century, a seeming miracle took place. Humans learned how to fly. But the quest to reach for the skies came with tremendous danger. Events and circumstances that in an instant could turn deadly. Every time a new barrier was pushed, the limits of gravity pushed back harder, making every advancement in the world of aviation one that was paid for in blood. Whether it was just getting off the ground with powered engines, soaring aloft in massive balloons or airships, or attempting long-distance journeys that seemed to guarantee disaster, early aviators were willing to take chances that few would ever try. The risks were many. Engines at the time often failed. Construction of aircraft was confusing and sometimes shoddy. Navigation across vast bodies of water, the most daring of all feats in aviation, could turn someone into a hero or put their name on a long list of aviators lost at sea. The harrowing tales of these aircrafts and their pilots are at once thrilling and heartbreaking. For every victory, there was wrenching loss. For every minute pilots logged soaring above the clouds, there were moments when the planes, the pilots, and their dreams came crashing back to Earth. Using restored film footage and high-definition photographs, we tell the stories that captured the world's imagination. The early years, when aviators put their lives on the line to slip the surly bonds of Earth and touch the face of the sky. On a fog-shrouded morning in August 1927, at a grass-covered airfield in Oakland, California, 13 of the world's greatest aviators gathered to attempt the seemingly impossible, to make a non-stop city-to-city voyage to Honolulu, Hawaii. This is the Dole Air Race, sponsored by the famed Pineapple Company's president, James Dole, who longs to connect the Hawaiian Islands with the mainland by air. An estimated 100,000 people gather at this rough and tumble stretch of grass to see these aircraft, loaded to the struts with reserve fuel, take off. The start of the race comes just 3 months after Charles Lindbergh made history by flying the Spirit of St. Louis 3,500 miles across the Atlantic Ocean from New York City to Paris. But flying from Oakland to Honolulu was much longer, 3,870 miles. And unlike crossing the North Atlantic, where there were large stretches of land that Lindbergh could have put down his plane, the trip to Hawaii was over nothing but miles and miles of deep blue Pacific water. As the first aircraft rumbles down the runway, no one knows that the Dole Air Race will soon turn into one of the most tragic air derbies in history. For centuries, the Hawaiian Islands had been a major stopping-off point for ships traveling between the United States and the Far East. Situated almost halfway between two continents, Hawaii played a key role in world trade and commerce. But travel by ship to Hawaii could take weeks. To link the islands by air would change the way the world worked, and James Dole knew it. The magic of flight first came to Hawaii in the 1880s, when, in 1889, The aerial daredevil, Joseph Lawrence Van Tassel, came to the islands with his breathtaking balloon stunt show. Van Tassel was following in a century-old tradition of men taking to the sky in some kind of balloon. During the Civil War, for example, troops from the Union and the Confederacy would launch soldiers in balloons to spy across enemy lines. It was the French that first took man aloft. On November 21, 1783, scientist Jean-François Pilatier de Rosier and aristocrat François Laurent Delong flew a balloon untethered for 20 minutes. 2 years later, de Rosier attempted to be the first to fly across the English Channel in a new kind of balloon, one that was half hot air, half hydrogen. Sadly, 30 minutes after taking off, the balloon exploded. Rosier and his co-pilot were killed, making Rosier the first person to fly in a balloon and the first person to die in one. The French loved hot air balloons. During the last part of the 19th century, there were hundreds of balloon shows, especially in Paris, drawing crowds of up to 100,000. During the Paris Exposition in the summer of 1878, a balloonist named Henri Giffard brought ballooning to the masses. He created a giant airship that could carry up to 50 passengers at one time. Between July 10th and November 4th of that year, Giffard's monstrous floating device carried 35,000 passengers, each lift rising 1,800 feet above the city. Sadly, Giffard's balloon was destroyed a year later in a hurricane. But his flying machine became legend for what was considered the world's first airline. In April 1875, French scientist Gaston Tissandier and two compatriots attempted to break the record of flying highest in a balloon. Though they were carrying oxygen aboard their balloon, named the Zenith, by the time the three made it to 28,200 feet, still short of the record, they all passed out. When the balloon drifted back to Earth, Tissandier's health was damaged for life. But his friends, scientists Joseph Crochet Spinelli and Theodore Sibel, were both dead. In the Père Lachaise Cemetery in Paris rests a monument to the two aviation pioneers, depicting them as they were found in their balloon's basket after descending back to Earth. A little more than a decade later, in the Hawaiian Islands, aeronaut Joseph Van Tassel had no intention of breaking records. He was here to entertain. The Ohio native set his first demonstration for November 2nd of that year. Attached to a hot air balloon by a trapeze, Van Tassel rose 1 mile into the air over Kapiolani Park, hung for a moment in the sky, and then jumped. He pulled a ripcord on his parachute and gently floated back to the green hillsides on the island of Oahu. The thousands who had shown up for his show were amazed. A man could fly. 3 weeks later, on November 22nd, Van Tassel was ready to do it again. This time he launched from the Punch Bowl, a large clearing in the city of Honolulu. As before, he rose about 1 mile in the air, drifting to a point above Richard and King Streets. He jumped and opened his parachute. However, a large gust of wind came along and lifted Von Tassel even higher. Instead of going to the ground, he floated for 5 miles and landed in the Kihei Lagoon. It took rescuers 30 minutes to reach the crash site. No trace of the aeronaut was ever found. Van Tassel became the first casualty of flight in Hawaii. The first powered flight of an aircraft in Hawaii came on New Year's Eve, 1910, when James Bud Mars lifted his Curtiss P-18 biplane off a polo field in Honolulu and wowed thousands of spectators who had turned out for the historic flight. And though 3,000 people had paid an entrance fee to the polo grounds, thousands more watched for free from the surrounding hillsides. After a second series of flights a week later, Mars left Hawaii, disgusted that so many people had watched his daredevil antics for free. And he complained that those who paid to attend didn't even cover his costs. Among those who see Curtiss fly that day was James Dole. It was the first time he had the idea that connecting Hawaii to the mainland could be possible. But it would take 17 more years before Dole would step forward and offer a $25,000 reward to the first pilot who could make the trip. He has no idea that his famous Dole Air Derby will eventually become one of early aviation's most tragic disasters. In the spring of 1904, the history-making pioneers of flight, Orville and Wilbur Wright, brought their flying machines to the Huffman Prairie, an 82-acre open field located a few miles outside their hometown of Dayton, Ohio. The famed brothers who, a year earlier, had made the first powered airplane flight in history, went to work perfecting their craft. Over the next decade, they developed the Wright Flyer, which they considered to be the first practical airplane. And it's here that they would train more than 100 pilots to fly. One man following closely in the Wrights' footsteps was Thomas Selfridge, a native of San Francisco. In 1907, he is one of 3 pilots trained to fly the Army Dirigible No. 1. Orville Wright brings one of his Wright Flyers to Fort Myers, Virginia, where Selfridge is stationed. Wright intends to do a demonstration for the Army brass at the base, and Selfridge will be his passenger. The duo makes 4 passes over the airfield at 150 feet, and everything goes fine. But on the 5th pass, the plane's right propeller breaks loose. This causes the aircraft to violently vibrate, which causes the rudder to completely fly off. The airplane slams hard into the earth, nose first. Wright survives with severe injuries. Selfridge suffers a fractured skull. He goes into surgery, but dies 3 hours later. Selfridge is the first person to be killed aboard a heavier-than-air aircraft. Despite the dangers, the allure of flight pushes aviation designers and pioneers to new heights. And the magic of flight catches the attention of newspaper and magazine magnate William Randolph Hearst. Hearst offers an award of $50,000 to any aviator who can fly across the states in any direction, coast to coast, in 30 days or less. For Calbraith Perry Rodgers, it is an offer too good to refuse. In March 1911, Rodgers traveled to the Wright brothers' Huffman Prairie Flight School. He takes 90 minutes of flying lessons from Orville Wright and becomes the 49th person to receive a pilot's license from the Wright brothers. Rodgers is also one of the first civilians to purchase a Wright Flyer airplane. Rodgers asks J. Ogden Armour of Armour and Company to sponsor his attempt to fly across the United States. In exchange, Rodgers will name his plane for one of the company's products. He chooses Vin Fizz, Armour's grape soft drink. Rodgers leaves Sheepshead Bay, New York on September 17, 1911. He is followed by a specially equipped train that carries on board extra parts. Although Rodgers plans to make many stops along the way, he makes many more than originally intended. 75 in all. He crashes 16 times. And instead of risking flying over the Rocky Mountains, Rodgers flies south to Texas and then west to California. On November 5th, having missed the prize deadline by 19 days, Rodgers lands in Pasadena, California, in front of a crowd of 20,000 people. On the 12th of that month, he takes off for Long Beach, the end of his trip. But he crashes a few miles short of his destination in Compton, California, and he's hospitalized for 3 weeks. Finally, on December 10th, he flies to and lands on the beach in Long Beach, California, and taxis the Vin Fizz into the surf of the Pacific Ocean, completing the unprecedented journey of over 4,000 miles. But just months later, tragedy strikes. On April 3rd, 1912, while making an exhibition flight over Long Beach, Rodgers' aircraft flies into a flock of birds. The plane crashes into the ocean. Rodgers' neck is broken, and he dies moments later. Not far from where, just a few months earlier, he had landed after making his historic cross-country journey. On the morning of January 18, 1911, crowds gather on the deck of the USS Pennsylvania in the San Francisco Bay. They are there to witness an aviation milestone. A young pilot named Eugene Ely is going to attempt to land his Curtiss pusher biplane on the deck of this warship. Less than a decade after the Wright brothers made their first flight, and several years before World War I would break out in Europe, Secretary of the Navy George von Lengerke-Meyer wants to find a way to use aviation for military purposes. He puts Captain Washington Chambers in charge of the project. Chambers decides that the first test will be to see if an airplane can take off from a warship, something that seems to most people to be even crazier than flying in an airplane. Chambers went to the Wright brothers and asked the Ohio natives to do it, and they said, "Forget it, it's too dangerous." Eventually, someone steps forward. He is a 24-year-old former chauffeur and car salesman named Eugene Ely. He had learned to fly when the owner of the car dealership at which he worked bought a Curtiss biplane. Ely thought he would give flying a try, and he promptly crashed. But he repaired the plane and, over time, eventually taught himself how to fly. Ely heard about the military's desire to have an airplane take off from a warship, and he volunteers. In November 1910, he finds himself sitting in his plane on a hastily built wooden platform aboard the deck of the USS Birmingham. Few people on the ship believe Ely will survive this never-before-attempted stunt. After taking a deep breath, Ely guns the throttle of his biplane, releases the brake, and the plane slowly starts to rumble down the 83-foot runway. Sailors are mesmerized and horrified, believing they are about to see a man die. The plane picks up steam, and as it nears the end of the ship, it appears that maybe, just maybe, Ely has enough thrust to make it. And then he drops out of sight. The Curtiss plummets towards the water. Witnesses rush to the edge of the makeshift runway. But instead of seeing Ely and a wrecked airplane in the ocean, the aircraft is skipping forward along the surface, its wheels dragging across the waves. And then, almost like an aviation miracle, Ely and his Curtiss rise into the air. He has done it. Eugene Ely is a hero. But like most heroes, especially in the world of early aviation, Ely is ready to conquer the next great obstacle. This time, again working with Captain Chambers, the pair decide Ely will land on the deck of a warship. If other pilots believe that Ely's stunt of taking off from a ship is crazy, they believe attempting to land on one is insane. Landing platform is built aboard the USS Pennsylvania, which sails into the San Francisco Bay, drops anchor, and waits for what all aboard hope will be history in the making. Sailors and other observers crowd the deck of the ship, hoping to catch a glance of this young aviation daredevil. At 10:45 a.m. on January 18, 1911, Ely takes off from San Bruno, California's Tanforan racetrack and heads towards the San Francisco Bay. The weather is clear with just a slight haze over the water. In preparation for this attempt, the plane has been outfitted with steel hooks, and 22 steel lines have been stretched across the deck of the ship to catch and slow the aircraft on its landing. The lines are attached to sandbags made out of sailors' duffel bags. At 10:58 a.m., the plane appears in the sky above the Pennsylvania. The ship's siren blares. Ely is close. 75 feet from the platform, he cuts his engine, committing himself to the landing attempt. There is no turning back. Ely will either make it or crash. The crowd holds its breath as Ely closes in on the Pennsylvania. The plane touches down at 35 miles an hour. For a brief moment, it appears that the hooks on Ely's plane are going to miss the lines and the aircraft will fly off the end of the ship. But the hooks catch. The plane jerks to a stop. The crowd, at first stunned and silent, now swarms Ely. His wife, Mabel, runs to him, kisses her husband, and says, "I knew you could do it." The captain of the Pennsylvania calls it the most important landing of a bird since the dove flew back to the ark. A reporter asks Ely later if he intends to continue flying. Ely replies, "I guess I will be like the rest of them, keep at it until I am killed." Little did he know how prophetic his words would be. Just 9 months after his historic landing on the Pennsylvania, on October 19, 1911, during an exhibition in Macon, Georgia, Ely's plane crashes. His neck is broken. Nothing can be done to save the young aviator. The first man to ever take off and land an airplane on a ship is killed in a crash during a simple exhibition on dry land. He was 24 years old. In his short career as a pilot, less than 2 years, Ely had done as much as any man to launch the era of aircraft use in the military. When World War I breaks out in Europe 2.5 years later, it will become clear just how important Ely's historic accomplishments have been. It seemed that California had more than its fair share of tragedy in the early age of flight. And the 2 weeks leading up to the infamous Dole air race in August 1927 is no exception. Some of the top flyers in the country are vying for the $25,000 prize to be the first to fly runway to runway from Oakland to Honolulu. But several air crews never even make it to the starting line. Arthur Rodgers, flying the Angel of Los Angeles, tries to jump clear of his plane as it nosedives into the ground. Rodgers is killed. On August 11th, an international CF-10 triplane called the Pride of Los Angeles crashes into the San Francisco Bay. Pilots J.L. Giffen and Theodore Lundgren are not hurt. But perhaps the most mysterious story of all comes the night before the race. It is discovered that the compass on one of the planes, the Miss Doran, has been tampered with. William Molosca of Flint, Michigan, who owned Lincoln Oil gas stations in that state, enters the plane in the contest. The plane is named after a 22-year-old schoolteacher from Flint, Michigan named Mildred Doran. She is a student pilot. When she hears about the race, she asks Molosca to come along. He agrees and even names the plane after her for good luck. As the crew made its way west from Michigan to Oakland to start the race, Doran becomes the darling of the Dole Air Derby. Now, just hours before takeoff, it is discovered that someone has tampered with the compass aboard the plane on which Doran is flying. Soon, the nation will learn that the Dole Air Race has been cursed from its start. Two years before more than a dozen pilots take off from Oakland, California, bound for Hawaii in the Dole Air Race, a different kind of cross-Pacific flight is attempted. It is August 1925, and two Navy flight crews are about to attempt the first trans-Pacific crossings from California to the Hawaiian Islands. With thousands of people lining the shore, two amphibious planes rumble across the water of an estuary near the San Francisco Bay. Laden with thousands of pounds of fuel, the aircraft can barely clear the surface of the sea. It takes 4 miles of bouncing on the water's waves before the planes can lift off, and another 4 miles before they can gain an altitude of even a few hundred feet. One of the pilots is named John Rodgers, a descendant of a long line of Navy officers. Rodgers is a pioneer in bringing flight to the United States Navy. On this trip across the Pacific, Rodgers is at the controls of the flying boat PN-9 number 1, along with a flight crew of 4 other Navy personnel. His colleague, Lieutenant Alan P. Snoddy, and his crew are flying in boat PN-9 number 3. But only 5 hours into his flight, Snoddy's plane experiences engine failure and has to land in the ocean. Because of the perils involved in such a long voyage over water, the Navy has positioned ships at 200-mile intervals along the route from the San Francisco Bay to Honolulu. For 1,400 miles, Rodgers and his crew follow the path they plotted, passing over the Navy ships along the way. But Rodgers had expected a bigger tailwind, one that never came, and he ran low on gas, so low that he knew he would never make it to Hawaii. So he radioed the next Navy ship ahead that he would have to land in the water and refuel. He would be about 300 miles from the island of Maui. But because of a series of rain squalls and misreported positioning, Rodgers never finds the next Navy ship. Instead, he lands in rough seas and waits for a rescue that never comes. For 3 days, Rodgers and his crew can hear reports on the radio of searchers looking for them. But because they were in the water and not in flight, they didn't have the power to send a message back to rescue ships, which pass within 5 miles of their ditched plane. The crew is out of food. They have very little water, and hopes of being found are fading. Rodgers decides they will have to save themselves. The crew improvises sails, fabric cut from the lower wing of the plane, and the aircraft begins to move toward Hawaii. On the 6th day, they run out of water, and by the 8th day, they are nearly dead, when a powerful rainstorm brings the relief they need. They are using the plane's rudder to steer the aircraft on the sea, but Rodgers knows they need some kind of keel in the water to guide them, or they could sail right past the Hawaiian Islands. The crew fashions pieces of the plane's metal floorboards to the bottom of the boat, and suddenly the aircraft is able to hold its course, just like a ship bound for Honolulu. 9 days after putting their airplane down in the ocean, an American submarine traveling a few miles off the coast of the island of Kauai discovers Rodgers and his crew. They are barely alive, but they have made it. The airplane is towed into a harbor, and the people of the island greet the weary crew as conquering heroes. They had covered a distance of 1,870 miles in the air, an official world's record, followed by an incredible sail of 450 miles at sea. Sadly, just a year later, Rodgers is killed when the aircraft he is piloting crashes into the Delaware River. He had sailed a stricken aircraft to Hawaii, but an uneventful flight over the state of Delaware is what killed him. While Rodgers and his crew had battled the elements off the coast of Hawaii in 1925, 5,000 miles away in the American Midwest, extreme weather led to one of the greatest disasters in early aviation. It involves one of the Navy's most prized airships, the helium-filled USS Shenandoah. It is piloted by Lieutenant Zachary Lansdowne, a veteran of dozens of airship trips, including the first one to cross the English Channel. The airship is fitted with 5 300-horsepower Packard engines, which are fueled by a dozen 133-gallon gas tanks inside the ship, giving the Shenandoah a range of 5,000 miles, flying at speeds of up to 70 miles an hour. She is christened on October 10, 1923, by Mrs. Edwin Denby, wife of the Secretary of the Navy. Mrs. Denby names the airship after her home in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. It is a Native American word meaning daughter of the stars. The Shenandoah is thought to be extremely airworthy. On September 2, 1925, the ship leaves Lakehurst, New Jersey, bound for California. But over eastern Ohio, the Shenandoah encounters a series of deadly updrafts and downdrafts that rip the ship apart. The control car with Captain Lansdowne and 6 other crewmen breaks loose from its position below the bow and drops to the earth near the Andrew Gamery tenant farmhouse, killing all occupants. The stern section, over 400 feet long, glides to earth with 18 men aboard and hits the ground near the Gamery farm. It is dragged along the earth near a tree line until it is momentarily snagged and 4 men are dumped out. The air then picks up the tail and lodges the stern against an opposite hillside. The 200-foot bow section, with 7 crewmen still inside, quickly rises to 10,000 feet, but is brought under control by venting helium from the intact gas bags and from releasing gasoline from the fuel tanks. 53 minutes later, it floats down, about 6 miles to the south of the initial breakup. As it approaches the ground, it brushes the Ernest Nichols farmhouse, tears out a post and a pole, and scrapes over the family's garage roof. Nichols grabs a line thrown from the bow and secures it to a pair of trees. Finally grounded, the crew jumps out, borrows a shotgun from Nichols, and bursts the gas bags before the bow is blown any further. The lieutenant commander who had guided the bow to earth, Captain Rosendahl, uses the Nichols telephone to call the telegraph office nearby and inform naval officers about the disaster. Within 5 hours of the wreck, more than 1,000 people arrive at the crash site to strip the hulks of anything they can carry. Newspapers report that the Shenandoah had quickly been looted by locals. Members of the U.S. Department of Justice swarm the surrounding areas, going door to door, looking for looted items, eventually carrying away 4 truckloads of personal effects of the crew and pieces of the doomed airship. Prior to his death, Shenandoah Captain Zachary Lansdowne had vowed to fly his ship where no man had gone before, over the Earth's polar ice caps. Aviator Lincoln Ellsworth takes up the challenge, first flying a dirigible across the North Pole, and then setting his sights on a tougher task, flying an airplane across the Antarctic and the South Pole. In 1935, he keeps his promise. Ellsworth and Hollick Kenyon's airplane, the Polar Star, arrive in Antarctica aboard the transport ship Wyatt Earp. The ship's crew unload the plane in pieces onto the ice. They place skis on it for wheels, assemble it, and Ellsworth and Hollick Kenyon take a few test flights with great success. The plane is working fine, but the crew doesn't realize that a crack in an ice floe about a mile away is about to create havoc with the journey. The crew parks the plane near the ship, but the ice suddenly begins to crumble just in front of them. Within a matter of minutes, the Polar Star is in danger of slipping beneath the waves. Using steel cables attached to the Wyatt Earp, the crew is able to rig safety lines to the Polar Star, which catches the plane and holds it aloft just moments before it would have submerged into the Antarctic Sea. Badly damaged, the Polar Star is taken apart and returned to the United States for repairs. On the morning of August 16, 1927, 100,000 people gather at a rough and tumble grass airfield in Oakland, California. All eyes are trained on 8 small airplanes and the 16 people who are about to take off in them. The infamous Dole air race is finally about to begin. The first to take off was a Travel Air 5000 called the Oklahoma. On board are pilot Bennett Griffin and navigator Al Henley. As the plane rolls down the bumpy runway, the crowd roars, drowning out the sound of the aircraft's engine. The wheels leave the ground, and the first plane in the air derby is aloft. But the day's first takeoff will also be the day's first failure. Before the plane can even reach the Pacific Ocean, its engine overheats, and the pilots have to make an emergency landing in San Francisco. The next to try and get into the air is the El Encanto, a Goddard special with Norman A. Goddard and Kenneth C. Hawkins on board. Many in the crowd expect this to be the plane that will win. But as the aircraft rumbles up to speed, it begins to wobble, swerves off the runway, and then tips over. The crew is unharmed, but the plane is wrecked. Next is the Popco Flyer, piloted by World War I aviator Livingston Gilson Irving. Irving does slightly better, managing to make it briefly into the air before crashing just over a mile from the runway. Like the crew of the El Encanto, Irving is unhurt. He makes hasty repairs on the plane, hoping for a second chance. But his next attempt is no better than the first. The plane crashes again and is finished. But Irving has survived. Next comes the Golden Eagle, carrying pilot Jack Frost and navigated by Gordon Scott. After the string of disastrous launches that morning, the Golden Eagle rises into the air almost effortlessly. Little did the crowd or crew know, as it cruised into the blue sky over the Pacific, its troubles are only beginning. The Miss Doran seems to have no problems at all taking off, but it returns to the Oakland airfield 10 minutes later with engine troubles. Mechanics quickly address the problem, and the Miss Doran takes off for a second time, following the Golden Eagle west towards Hawaii. The last two planes to make it into the air are the Aloha with Martin Jensen at the helm, accompanied by navigator Paul Schulter, and the Woolaroc, piloted by Arthur Goebel and navigated by William Davis Jr. Both planes have smooth takeoffs and make it into the sky without trouble. Of the 18 planes that had entered, only 8 had made it to the runway in Oakland. And of those 8, only 4 are now out over the Pacific Ocean. As the sun sets that evening, hopes are high for the aviators' prospects. Everyone believes, with the aircraft finally on their way, the disastrous lead-up to the Dole air race is behind them. The next morning, crowds gather in Honolulu and squint into the sky for signs of the planes. When a tiny dot appears over the ocean, a Boeing PW-9 is immediately sent up from Wheeler Field to greet the incoming aircraft and guide it to the airfield. Just over 26 hours after taking off from Oakland, the Woolaroc has made it. Art Goebel and William Davis have won the $25,000 first prize. More importantly, they have survived. Goebel breaks into a huge smile and raises his hands in triumph as the greeting party in Hawaii drapes leis over his head. 2 hours later, the aptly named Aloha touches down with pilot Martin Jensen winning the $10,000 second prize. A bit of a cheapskate, Jensen gives Paul Schulter, his navigator on the long journey, $25 for his efforts. But as the hours stretch toward evening and the crowds in Honolulu begin to leave, there is still no sign of the Golden Eagle or the Miss Doran. 3 submarines are sent out to search for the plane. One of the planes that failed to make it into the sky the previous day, the Dallas Spirit, leaves California and heads west to join the search. That aircraft and its crew are never seen again. Despite more than a week of searching by aircraft and ships, nothing of the other airplanes is ever found. Jack Frost, Gordon Scott, Augie Pedler, Vilas Nope, and Mildred Doran were all lost at sea. The grand spectacle that was to be the Dole air race had turned into a grand nightmare. During the first few decades of powered flight, daring aviators were willing to risk their lives to push the limits of taking to the skies. Some of them fell back to Earth in their flying machines, sometimes in spectacular fashion. But it was because of these daredevil men and women that the world of aviation was able to move forward in ways never before dreamed. Every person who sat inside an airplane or an airship during the early phases of flight knew the risks they were taking. But they also knew that testing the limits of possibility was the only way to fly higher, faster, and farther. From the tragedies they left behind came new advances in flight safety and reliability, leading to today's remarkable world of man's ability to soar into the heavens with a nearly unencumbered ability to fly.